Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm deeply in love with all things beautiful that make life bloom. I believe that with every step we take, we can make life grow stronger. Some think that that's a struggle, but I think that it can be done in all sorts of fun and enjoyable ways. That is why I started to film the Life Keeper's Diaries. Here is where I share my views of beauty, my ways of giving back to life, and my sparkles of creativity. I think those are exactly the ways of how to fill life with joy and love for ourselves and others. That is the way of a life keeper.
There's a message drifting in the air. If you listen, you will notice music everywhere. This bridge is made of hope. This bridge is made of hope.
Hello, Rob. I'm really happy that you're here with us today. This is a completely fresh experience for me because I started this Life Keeper's Diaries YouTube channel about a year ago, but now it's at, let's say, changing point because I also decided to invite people from outside Slovenia to talk to me. There's a lot of beautiful things going on around the world. So I really want to people to see that we can change this world for the better. We can make it a wonderful place for all of us. And I think that you are doing a very, very wonderful thing. So I usually start when I talk to people with, can you tell something about yourself? Can you tell about the things that you do, what matters to you, what inspires you? Maybe for the beginning, you can just tell something about yourself.
So hello everybody, I'm Rob. I live in the southwest of England in a town called Totnes. For many years I was a teacher of permaculture and natural building and things like that. And then in 2005-06, as you say, I was one of the people who started the transition movement, which then took off, and you can now find transition groups in about 50 different countries around the world in thousands of communities. And I'm sure we'll come on to talk about what that actually is, but it's kind of, we like to think of it as a movement of communities that are reimagining and rebuilding the world. And so I still live in Totnes. I work a bit with Transition Network, which is the organization that we started to support the spread of the transition movement. I host a podcast called From What If to What Next, which we record an episode of that every 2 weeks. I write books, as you say. I do a lot of public speaking about these subjects and trainings. I'm also part of a couple of projects in my town. I'm one of the people who started the New Lion Brewery, which is the UK's first 100% community-owned brewery. If any of your listeners ever come to England, you have to come because it's the best beer in the whole country, guaranteed. And I'm also part of a project called Atmos Totnes, which is a very ambitious community-led development project. And in my spare time, which there isn't very much of, I like to do printmaking and drawing. And I have 4 kids who are kind of older now and sort of mostly leaving home. I like gardening. That's about it, really. That's me.
Okay, wonderful. You've already said that we'll probably come to transition movement, which is the whole point of this conversation. So maybe this is the point when you talk more about that. I've been to Totnes because just finding out about transition was just so wow to me. So I really wanted to feel it too. As you talk in your podcast conversations, you always say that it's not just about knowing about some things, but can you picture it? Can you smell it? So I wanted to do that. I wanted to actually go there and see it. And to me, when I was coming back home, and I knew that people will ask me, so how was it? I always told them it was just different. There was just so many different things, so many ways in which people live and function and create their own life. It was really an inspiration. So can you just tell more about transition in general, and maybe also about your local transition things? Because the thing that I love most about transition was that it's not just one picture for everyone, like copy paste, but it really adjusts to the certain situations in certain communities.
Yeah, so the way I often like to describe it is, if you imagine in 2022, the global north is kind of up here, standing on top of a mountain, and underneath it is more plastic and carbon and debt and anxiety and inequality than we've ever stood on top of before. And many people in the world are sort of about here, and we know that the place that is sustainable for us to live is around here. So the transition movement was always designed to say, okay, we need to get from here to here really, really fast. That's not going to happen if the story that we tell ourselves is that this is irreplaceable, this is non-negotiable, this is the best it'll ever be, and that nothing else is possible, and that anything down here is somehow a move away from something incredible. It has to feel like, wow, this place down here, this is awesome. That's that, if we can cultivate the longing up here for this place, then we're going to do it, right? So we always designed transition to say the piece that's missing when we started talking about this, 2005, 2006, was, where is the storytelling in our culture about this place? Where's the storytelling in our culture about how delicious and extraordinary and remarkable a low carbon future could be? And how do we start that here? How do we start to tell the stories? How do we start to give people examples, what I like to think of as kind of pop-up tomorrows? How do we give them a flavor of that now? That means that that's where they'll want to go. So that was really where we started with transition in my little town here in Totnes, which is a town that has quite a long history of being a sort of experimental, radical, kind of alternative town. And we just started it really as an inquiry, like, what would it look like if the response to climate change started with us here, with the people around us, doing what we're passionate about? And within a few months of us kicking it off here, we were getting emails from New Zealand and Mongolia and Brazil and places, people going, what is this thing? And how do we do it? And we said, we have no idea how to do it. We really don't know. We're just making it up as we go along. But we'll share what we know. So we shared, I had a blog at the time called Transition Culture, and everything was shared on there, everything that we found, everything that inspired us, everything that we did. And then it just started to take off like mad. And it got to the stage where there was two of us, I think, who were responding to this kind of deluge of interest, and people saying, what is this? What is this? How do we do it? What is this? And so we started an organization called Transition Network to try and support the whole movement. So transition really is something which people do where they are. As you say, it's not like a Coca-Cola franchise. It's not like everyone has to do it exactly the same wherever they are. So I speak to transition groups in Japan and Chile and Italy, wherever, even different neighborhoods of London. They create a version of transition that fits with their passion and fits with their place, but it is at the same time distinctly transition. And I feel, for me, it's one of the successes of transition is its ability to sort of fit with wherever it goes. And I always tell a story about how about 2 or 3 years after we started doing the transition movement, and it was really taking off very, very fast, I was invited to London by a group of business people who had formed an organization which looked out for interesting social entrepreneurs. And they said, come and give us a presentation. And if we like what you do, then we'll offer you help in terms of marketing and fundraising and stuff. So I went and I sat at this long glass table on the 14th floor of some office block somewhere. And I gave this 15-minute presentation about the transition movement. And when I finished, there was a long silence. And this man said, so what you've done is create a really powerful brand and then give it away for free to people all over the world, and you have no control over them at all. I said, yeah, that is exactly what we've done. He was like, I can't, that's what? I can't, that's beyond my understanding. I said, but it works. So it's a movement that's based on a huge amount of trust. But actually that's where you start to find the solutions, and that's where you start to come into the stories. Every week, the transition movement generates a story where we're going, wow, that's cool. I'd never have thought of that. And that's kind of the beauty of something like transition, I think.
Wow, that's so amazing. I mean, usually when you start talking to people about trust and about, those sorts of cooperations, they're usually like, oh my God, which clouds are you living in? But obviously you are a very good example of that it can be done, and that it can be inspirational for everyone. As we're talking about inspiration, the way you usually start your conversations on your podcast is, how does the world look in 10 years from now, when we've taken all the good steps and done all the good changes? And you usually ask other people about this, but now I would like to ask you so that you can spark this longing for the better world.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to say is why it's important to do that, I think, which is we are surrounded by so many narratives of dystopias and collapse, and the argument that somehow those things are inevitable. And, it's not like climate change. Climate change is here, it's happening, it's not going to magically disappear. But at the same time, if we were to see a radical reimagining of everything in line with what climate scientists are demanding that we do, then it offers us we can still avoid the worst excesses of the climate emergency, and we could create a world that's really quite extraordinary. So whenever I do that exercise, and whenever I close my eyes and imagine that world, I imagine a future in maybe 10, 15 years from now, where it feels like the culture around us has really shifted in a different direction. There is a shared sense of purpose and a shared sense of direction that we have to reimagine everything, because our future, our survival depends upon it, but that we're able to see that as an incredibly exciting possibility. So our education system has been reimagined. So it's not about testing so much, so that it's really about giving young people an immersive experience of everything they will need in order to be able to flourish in a rapidly changing world. So they learn a lot about personal and mental and emotional resilience. They go to schools which are living and breathing examples of a low carbon society. By then we have realized that becoming a low carbon society is about so much more than electric cars and air source heat pumps. It requires a deep shift in our expectation about the levels of consumption that is going to be possible, about our expectations in terms of travel and the levels of consumer goods. So actually levels of consumption have fallen considerably, but levels of mental health, standards of mental health have increased hugely, because we knew in 2022 that when you designed a society, based on consumerism, you inevitably saw a rise in depression, and you saw a rise in addiction. When you design a society based on well-being and contentment and connection, actually all of the indicators start going in the right way. So the amount of money as societies that we have to spend on mental health has fallen by about 3/4 since 2022. The amount of money we have to spend on health in general has fallen a lot because it's about promoting well-being. Food production is something that has become sustainable, much more local. All cities now are surrounded by what's called a food belt, growing food and other produce that is consumed within that city. Not everything they need, but the majority of what they need. You know, back in 2022, you could say that local agriculture provided the icing on top of the cake, and the cake came in from all over the world, wherever it could be found cheapest. Now we import the icing, but the cake is produced within our local kind of region. The epidemic of loneliness that we saw in 2022 has gone. The idea that government can only move in small incremental steps was shown by the COVID outbreak of 2020 to 2022 as being a complete myth. And so governments are now recognizing the need to really move very quickly and very boldly in terms of addressing the climate emergency. We're starting to see biodiversity returning to our towns, to our cities. We've seen a big change as well in terms of how money is spent in terms of policing, that we no longer think we just need to spend more and more money on policing, but we recognize we need to spend that money on education and on supporting the poorest people. There's no economic precariousness anymore. We have a universal basic income which supports people and stops people from falling. It's a world where there are much less cars. We realized in 2023 that this massive push for electric cars was not designed around saving the planet, it was designed around saving the car industry. And so towns and cities were designed so that you just didn't need a car. And so our cities now are starting more to resemble forests with buildings in, as we take streets back for food gardens, for trees. I could go on for hours and hours and hours. I don't know much, but for me, one of the lovely things when I do this on the podcast, with every episode has 2 guests, and we start with doing this exercise, as you say, I invite them into my time machine. We travel to 2030. Is one of the reasons it's so important is that the activists who come onto it, and the thinkers and the writers who come onto it, when you are working as an activist like that, it's like you're just up against the problems all the time. You're responding to the problems all the time. And we never take the time to sit with those people and say, describe that future to us that gets you out of bed every morning, that you never get to speak to anyone about, because everyone just wants to know what the problems are all the time. And it's so fascinating and beautiful. And I also do that exercise, the time machine exercise, when I do talks. So I've done it with 1,500 people in a hall in Brussels, and I've done it with 10 people in workshops. The thing that's most fascinating to me, and then I'll stop talking about this, but the thing that's most fascinating about that to me is that when we live in a time when social media would make us believe that we all completely disagree on everything, and that there is no common ground, and that everybody hates each other, and that there is no common sense of what the future could be like. When I do that exercise, and I ask people to close their eyes and to imagine that they're traveling forward to 2030, and then the whole room sits in silence for 2 minutes as people take a walk around in that world. What does it smell like? What does it sound like? And then I ask people to share back. The first things are always, the bird song is so much louder. There's much less cars. The air smells fantastic. There's a shared sense of collective purpose. I hear laughter, I hear music, I hear streets full of people who are doing things every time, with really different audiences every time. So it's like, okay, so maybe we start there and then we work back from there, and we try and figure out what we have to do so that every step along the way benefits the poorest people in society first. That seems really quite straightforward to me. And then actually we find that maybe we're not as different as we all thought we were, because then what we're talking about is the politics of contentment rather than the politics of pleasure. And that feels like a really important kind of insight to me.
Yeah, and I think that, as you said, we usually talk about pretty much the same thing. And often people are afraid that if we started living ourselves, our deepest dreams, then it would be chaos. But in reality, I think we are designed as all the rest of the life in this universe that strives for harmony. So I think in the end, we would all want to live together in something beautiful, harmonious. So I think we would all start to find our own piece in this whole puzzle that would be working good with all the rest of the pieces. So I think,
yeah, and I think when you say, well, people say, well, there would be chaos. I mean, there is absolute chaos at the moment. We are surrounded by total chaos, and the idea that the market will solve all of our problems has spectacularly failed. And I think that one of the reasons that there is chaos is because back in the 60s and the early 70s, we had this idea that politics could kind of be utopian, or could articulate a vision that it then wanted to work towards. So Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream, these movements that talked about kind of utopian futures and filled the future in front of us with things that we could go, yeah, a world where there's this and there's that, and I have a dream, Then all of that went. And when that happens, when we stop talking about the future as something that can cultivate longing, what happens is that the far right come in and they say, oh, the future looks really scary. We'll protect you from that. So the future becomes something frightening. The future becomes something that we need protecting from. And you see the rise of Trump and Orban and all these kind of people. And so it feels like actually putting an articulate storytelling, I have a dream, back into our politics in 22 is one of the main ways that we can fight fascism. Actually, if we can make our politics more playful, more full of dreams, more full of stories, the far right hate that. And if we can base that storytelling on the things that we know we have in common and how we're going to get there, then I think it's something that is far more important than just something that we do because it feels nice. It's actually pretty vital to our survival, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's also quite important to realize that it's not about somebody else that's going to save us all, but it's about being a constructive element in the whole story. So finding your own place and doing your own job. Yeah. So now this little game that you play with your interview is about picturing the world as it could be, or as it will be. It's a part of your premise that we really need to harness imagination. So imagination is a vital part of us actually getting to a better place. So could you talk about that a little bit? Because I know you have a lot to say about imagination.
Yeah, it's so my favorite definition of imagination is from a guy called John Dewey, who is an American educationalist, who described it as the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise. Which it feels to me like if there were any superpower we need in 2022, it's the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise. Margaret Thatcher very famously said in the 1980s, there is no alternative. And I think that idea lodged itself deep in our collective psyche, this idea that somehow this is it, this is as good as it gets, and there's nothing else, nothing else apart from that system. Capitalism is very good at making us believe, as several people have said, that it's easier to believe in the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And capitalism is a great model in many different ways, but it has this inbuilt flaw that it is very shortly going to eradicate life from this planet, which is a fairly major oversight, really. So the imagination, I started looking into the imagination because I kept reading people whose work I really respect, like Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein and George Monbiot and Amitav Ghosh, and people who write about the climate emergency, who kept writing climate change is a failure of the imagination. I would read this and I thought, that's really interesting. What do you mean by that? By which time they were off talking about something else, and I was left there going, what did you mean by that bit there? And so I started thinking, well, are we living in a time where our imagination is somehow more impoverished or weaker than it should be? And I found some fascinating research from 2010, which suggested that yes, actually, our collective ability to be imaginative has been declining since the mid-1990s. The researcher said that that was due to the decline of play in our society, the rise of screens, and the rise of testing in our education system. And so that was kind of the beginning of the inquiry, really. So are we living in a time of imaginative poverty? How have we let that happen? What are the factors that are driving that? And how might we set about rebuilding it? And it's all kind of led me on to this idea. I'm just starting to think about the next book, which is going to be about this idea of imagination infrastructure. How do you build an imagination infrastructure? How do you build in a society the support? If our imagination, if Walida Imarisha, who's an amazing Black activist in America, she says, you cannot build what you cannot imagine. I mean, it's kind of obvious, right? Everything that is built has been imagined first. And if our imagination, which should be a muscle like this, is actually like this, then we're really, really in trouble. And we see many factors around us in the world that are actively eroding our ability to see things as if they could be otherwise. Capitalism doesn't even entertain the thought that anything could be otherwise. So so what I did in the book was to try and find some of the best examples I could of where people were prioritizing imagination, where they were putting it at the heart of their activism. One of my favorite stories that I found recently was about a guy called Edward Makuka Nkoloso, who lived in Zambia in the early 1960s. So Zambia had just become an independent nation from British colonial rule a couple of years beforehand. And this was at a time when America and Russia were competing to get the first man onto the moon. The space race had begun, and Edward announced that he was creating the Zambian space program, that actually the first person on the moon was going to be from Zambia, and it was going to be a young woman from Zambia, and that he was going to build a rocket, and he was going to get there before the Americans did. And so he wrote to NASA and the Zambian government, lots of people asking for money. There's beautiful film on YouTube of his training camp for his astronauts. One of the things he did to prepare them for weightlessness in space was to roll them down a hill in an oil drum. Anyway, the whole thing was a complete disaster and didn't work, and they didn't get any funding. And at the time, he was a subject of derision, and everybody said this guy's completely mad. Actually, when he died about 20 years ago, he was awarded the highest honor that the Zambian government give to anybody, because actually he opened that imagining space within Zambian culture to say, yeah, actually, why not have the first person on the moon be from Zambia, be a Black person, young black woman from Zambia flying a Zambian flag on the moon? Why not, And so I feel like we need an awful lot more of that in our activism. One of my favorite things I saw a couple of years ago when the Black Lives Matter protests were really at their peak in America was a t-shirt that said, "I've been to the future, we won." And it kind of gave me goosebumps. I just thought it was beautiful. It's like, yeah, I've been to the future, we won. And I think that our activism around climate, around social justice, around environmental collapse would be really powerful, more powerful, if we were able to speak from the future. Because so many people, it's like, what would a low carbon future be like? And there's so many people who would like you to believe it would be like sitting in a cold cave eating green potatoes covered in mud, And actually, it could be absolutely phenomenal and extraordinary, and getting there could be the most exhilarating ride of our lives, and it's like, that's kind of why the imagination piece is so important. And we have to create the best conditions within our society, within our activism, within our education system, within our campaign movements, for the imagination really to flourish. And that's really what I write about in the book. I don't think we can do this in the time that we have without this feeling like we have lived through a revolution of the imagination. And if you want to create a revolution of the imagination, it's not going to happen by accident. You have to create the right conditions for it. And that's really what I seem to be doing an awful lot of thinking about at the moment. How do you do that?
All right, so I would like to explore that a bit further. I used to work as a teacher in a kindergarten and in a school, and I was in a Waldorf system, which is a lot about free play, imagination, this inner source of every human being to create something, whatever that is for each individual. And then also in quite a similar system, another one. So we had a lot of this space where we could create, where we could bond, and then find something for the whole group. And it was really amazing, because often I hear people that children today are not able to cooperate, and then that they have no motivation of their own, and that they're really not imaginative. But when you give them time and space to do that, they can be just as creative as human beings were 500 years ago or whenever, because it's inherent inside of us. So I think that a big part of this lack of imagination is in schooling system, in educational system, which I think it's really tragical, because education should be about inspiration, about fun, about so many wonderful things that you can learn and discover and grow through it. I've seen or heard, I think, you talking that your children were in a different schooling system, so in democratic school, if I'm not mistaken. So could you talk a bit about this, that you know through your children, and also maybe about some things that you've noticed around the world, which were the good practices in this field?
Yeah, I went to a Waldorf school for a couple of years. Yeah, so when I did the chapter in the book about education, I've written quite a few books where at the beginning I've had to do a lot of research about. Every book I've written before has a chapter about climate change and where we're at, so I have to go and read all the climate science, which is just heartbreaking. I always say to people, if you don't regularly feel really quite terrified about the climate emergency, then you're not paying attention, and you really owe it to yourself to go and read that stuff, because it's really, really, really important. But I have to say, the research that I did for the chapter on education was almost as heartbreaking, actually. The impact that the current education system is having on young people's imagination really troubled me hugely. And like you say, that I spoke to a researcher who has done research for the last 30 years on kids between the ages of 3 and 5 on their ability to be imaginative. She said, there's been no decline. I've seen no decline at that age. Something happens when they reach the age of 5 or 6, and it just tanks. And what happens is the modern education system, which in the UK, I found reports of kids as young as 4 taking days off school from stress because of the testing that they were being put under. It becomes about, creative writing becomes about learning all these dry terms and about structures, rather than just loving words and how they sound in your mouth, and telling stories and loving words, and how we disincentivize. We don't have to teach kids to walk. We don't have to teach them how to breathe. We don't have to teach them how to speak. But somehow we have an education system where quite a high percentage of kids leave school at 16 unable to read and write. And obviously there are some other issues in some cases that are to do with that. But often we just massively demotivate kids sometimes. So yeah, two of my kids went to a democratic school where the kids had the power to hire teachers, to fire teachers, to change the school rules, to change what was taught in the school. They could do anything, but in a school meeting, and they had to learn how to make decisions together. So actually, you might think, oh my God, it'd be chaos. The kids would, sack all the teachers and turn the whole building into a skate park. And actually, that's not what happens. What happens is that they learn those tools, which are massively important and have really, really served them well in life. And I remember when the Fridays for Future climate strikes first started in Australia, and the Australian Prime Minister at the time said, "This is terrible, and these kids should be in school. Schools shouldn't be parliaments." I thought, actually, that's exactly what they should be. Why not? If we want to be training, if we want kids to have the best experience, to be able to go out into the world and be really employable and really confident, absolutely, the kids should run the schools. Why not? We did an episode of the podcast called "What If Young People Reimagined the Education System?" and with two phenomenally articulate young people, and that was their main thing. We need it to be genuine, not some silly school council thing where you don't really get to change anything. So I feel like education has become kind of in service to capitalist markets. It doesn't really, it needs to be something which is not about presenting kids with problems and saying, what's this, there is one solution to this, which there never is in real life. It's like, figure this out. There's loads of ways to do it. All of the people, like in the book, I write about lots of different examples around the world of education models that put imagination at their heart. And when I asked them, what inspired you? And they all talked about a place in Italy called Reggio Emilia, which is a place where at the end of the Second World War, as the Germans retreated north, all they had left was, or the Germans left behind a tank and 3 trucks and 6 horses or something. And they sold those things and used the money to build a school. And the school was based on the fundamental idea of how do you design an education system to make sure that fascism never happens again, which feels like a pretty fundamental thing that we would expect from any education system. But that's not quite what's happening around the world right now. So in that model, the idea is that you don't learn by subject, you learn by project. And at the heart of every school is a workshop where you can go at any time of day and someone there will help you make whatever it is that you want to make. They design the schools in a particular way so they're like so that they're full of plants and full of light. They're really embedded in the community that they serve. And it struck me that actually what we've done in many Western nations now is to create an education system that is almost the complete opposite of Reggio Emilia. And we're seeing a resurgence of fascism. It's like, well, that's a surprise then, isn't it? So if we want to create, there's so much I think that we can learn from that system. So I mean, the education system is fundamental. And when we do the thing in the podcast where we ask people, what do we need to do to get there? So much of it comes back to the education system and reimagining the education system.
It's really interesting when you talk about this school in Reggio, that it was about something terrible not happening again. And it was pretty much the same with Steiner and with Montessori, because they both also wanted to do that. So the bottom line of Montessori education or pedagogy system was that it would be a pedagogy for peace. And Steiner's premise was that they've been through a terrible thing, First World War, so that it shouldn't happen again. And he wanted to create a system that would empower people not to do such a horrible thing again, so that they would realize what's happening and just go a different direction. So it's really strange to me that this has been discovered many times before, but we're still doing the same mistake again and again, which is really quite sad, I think.
There's a school very near where I live that ran from the 1950s to the 1980s called Dartington School. That was a very, very progressive school at the time. And I interviewed a woman called Marina who moved from Spain. She was a refugee from the Civil War. She moved to Spain in the 1940s and she taught there for about 30, 40 years. And when I said to her, what was good about being there? What was good about that school? She said, the best thing was that we never produced a single general, a single bishop, or a single banker. And for her, that was the sort of the mark of the success of the school. And and also, when we look at the people who run, certainly here in the UK, you look at the people who are running the country so spectacularly, selfishly and badly, they all went through a very brutal kind of humiliating, emotionally crippling boarding school education, which I think really, having had a private education in that way, should really make you ineligible for public service, because we're basically run by the damaged, fearful inner child of those people in a way that is just massively, massively unhelpful.
You've also mentioned the civic imagination offices that you've, I'm not sure if you've really experienced them, but you know them. So it's not only reserved for schools, but for the whole community. So could you talk about that as well?
Yeah, it was. When I was writing the book, I was about 3 weeks away from submitting the final manuscript. Like it was done. I was just doing the very final editing, and then somebody messaged me and said, "Oh well, of course you'll know all about the Civic Imagination Office in Bologna." What? Wow, how have I not heard of this before? And then I had sort of 2 frenzied weeks of trying to find more about it and research about it and get hold of the guy who ran it, which I did just in time. So in Bologna in Italy, which is the most kind of progressive city in Italy, it's the city where the majority of people are the member of at least 2 or 3 cooperatives just as part of daily life. It's really fascinating city. It's also beautiful. If any of you have ever been to Bologna, it has the most covered arcades of any city in the world. I love it. And they found in about 2012 that there had been a real decline in engagement in the city, in democracy, that the number of people voting had fallen quite sharply. And a woman went to see the mayor and said, I want to paint a bench on my street a different color. Do you realize that if I was to do that through your municipality, it would take me about 9 months and I'd have to go through 6 different government departments to get the permission just to paint a bench a different color. So it led to them really rethinking how democracy was going to work in the city. And they came up with this idea of a civic imagination office, not a civic participation office or a civic engagement office, specifically a civic imagination office. It's based on the idea of saying, so they created 6 laboratories in different neighborhoods around the city where they would run big community visioning open space days. But the really brilliant bit was that when the community would come up with a good idea, so when the community would say, I don't know, we want to create a new garden or whatever it was, the municipality would say, great idea. Okay, we can offer this, 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 and this. You can offer that and that. Good, let's make a pact. And so they started making pacts. In the last 5 years, the Civic Imagination Office has led to 500 pacts between the municipality and the community, from really small things like new gardens on streets to really ambitious things like taking over an old office block and turning it into a school to train young people as classical musicians. It's now the main way that they find uses for empty buildings. It's now the main way they distribute money through participatory budgeting. What I loved about it, the bit that really excited me about it, was that that on the rare occasions in 2022 when our imagination is invited, is valued, is wanted, it tends to then be patronized and kind of humiliated, ignored. And after a while of that, we get invited to a consultation where really they've decided what they want to do. We're just there to pretend that there was a consultation together. And many people's experience of work life, family life, political life is that there is just no room for the imagination. So what I loved about the thing in Bologna was that they invite the community to be imaginative, and then they meet the community in the middle. And if we can do that more, we start to create the capacity to draw imagination up through society. Yeah, we dreamt that and then we did it. And look, it's over there. And if we can do that, then what else could we do? So you get this kind of drawing up kind of a thing. So I feel like everywhere should have a civic imagination office. Every organization should have a civic imagination office, in the same way that the Swedish government have created a position of a chief storyteller. There's a guy called Per Gronqvist, who is the Swedish government's chief storyteller, and his job description is to bring to life the day-to-day realities of living in a low-carbon future. I mean, what a great job is that, and I feel like every organization should have a chief storyteller, every government should have a chief storyteller, and we should have civic imagination offices on every single high street.
So you've mentioned that it's not the same as the participation office. And now we just had like a call in our municipality that inhabitants of our municipality can submit the ideas for the participation budget. But I think it's just not a good way of inviting people, because then we're isolated from each other. But the imagination, I think, strives the most when we come together and we actually communicate what's needed, so that every single participant has an input, so that the ideas can grow. What do you think about that? Because I've been thinking about that a lot lately, because I thought that's just not the point of how municipalities should work.
I think Gil Scott-Heron wrote that very famous song, "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." I kind of feel like if we were updating it for 2022, it would be "The revolution will be well facilitated." We need we need an army of really good facilitators who can facilitate community processes that invite people's participation, invite people's imagination, that recognize that the best ideas, the best solutions are going to come from us imagining together and dreaming together. And that doesn't happen by accident. It's what I call a what if space. If we can create those and hold those what if spaces. I'm part of a project in my town I mentioned at the beginning, which is called Atmos Totnes, which is the most ambitious community-led development project in the country, where we are working for the community to become the developer on an 8-acre former industrial site, where there is one building that's a protected building, which has to stay. Everything else is old factory that will be knocked down. We ran a consultation in a town of 8,500 people, which said, anything could happen on here. This is a completely blank slate. Anything could happen here. And we ran it as a really playful, interactive, really creative process. We had more than 4,000 contributions from the public. It was really participatory. And you might think, but if you get 4,000 ideas from a community about what should happen there, that's just going to be chaos. Like, how on earth are you going to process that and find anything in common? Actually, when you do it well with really good facilitators, it comes through very clearly what people want. And then you go back and you say, kind of like this, and they go, yeah, but a bit more like that. And you go, okay. And then you do something, and you come back and say, you like that? And they go, yeah, with a bit more of that. And it's absolutely possible that you can create and facilitate those kind of processes. But they're only going to happen if there is a really clear aspiration that's what we want to happen. It's not going to happen by accident. It's going to happen because we say that's what's going to happen. So there are people who can do that, and what we need to be really training so many people up who have that kind of those facilitation skills to enable that kind of thing to happen.
And I think that we're often afraid of the fact that there's always a journey. It's not something that's going to just happen in the first trial or the first second that you start working on it, but it's usually a huge process. Like when we try to do something like this participatory office in our municipality, the first meeting was really horrible because everybody that was full of rage over everything that's not been done in the last 30 or 50 years, they came there and they just blew off the lid on everybody else, and it was really quite loud and horrible. But I think that's kind of expected if you're not dealing with anything pretty much for such a long period, and then you just try to clean up the mess that's been done. But I think that we shouldn't be discouraged by the fact that, yeah, a lot's been done that wasn't good, but now we have this chance to do it better, and just to go on this journey and realize that we don't know everything now, that we'll learn many things along the way. Yeah.
And it's a really I think it's that terror of hearing those voices of people saying this has not gone well. That is why a lot of people in local government don't want to do a process like that. But we have to let that out, and then working with communities is not tidy or easy, or it's hard work and it can be quite bruising sometimes. But I think that we have to get an awful lot better at it, because many of the solutions to the climate emergency can only be done from the local level. And national government would never think of them in a million years. The transition movement is full of great examples of things that we can do to address the climate crisis that start where we live and start with the people that we have, and it's too important an aspect of this for us to just for us not to do it skillfully.
You've been around for a long time by now, so since 2005 probably a lot of things have happened, and as I've mentioned, we've started this sort of office in our municipality some time ago, and it was going well. So we've had some really nice projects that were successful, and also mayors from other places came to see what we've done, and also some students from abroad, and they were all very excited about it. But then the policy in the municipality changed, and the support was withdrawn. So you've probably been through quite a lot by now, and you've probably had some of those experiences as well. So can you tell something about how you're dealing with it? How come that you're still around and so successful?
Well, I don't know that I'm successful particularly. I think I'm a great believer in stubbornness. I think stubbornness is a really important human trait. The work that needs to be done and the changes that need to happen are not going to come about. They don't come about overnight. This kind of work is not like instant wins. I feel like one of the main things that we need to do is to be trialing and showing what's possible and telling the stories of what's possible based on real life experiments, so that when the people who are currently in charge finally realize the scale and the gravity of the problem, then we have the solutions here, ready. Here we go. This is what we need to do. So, this project that I'm involved with, this the Atmos project, this community-led development project, I've been working on that project for 14 years. And And it's one of the most extraordinary, one of the most ambitious things that I'm involved in. It's incredible, but it is also the result of real determination and stubbornness and belief, and times when it just has looked like it's just not going to happen. You know, we just keep the focus. You know, we need the power, I think, of going back to what we talked about at the beginning about imagination and longing, is that when we have a sufficiently clear vision in our head, and we have that kind of longing in our stomach for realizing that, then it becomes a kind of a new North Star in our life. And I take a huge amount of inspiration from movements in the past that have really skillfully helped people to create a kind of a new North Star in that way. So, for example, in America, the prison abolition movement in America, largely in the Black community in America, of saying, actually, prison as an institution is far more violent than what most people do to end up in prison. And we need to, you know, what if there were no prisons? What if there were no police? Which for me is such an incredible question, because it makes you think, okay, so if we had no prisons, what would our education system need to be like if we were to not need prisons? How would funding work of poor communities and policing and so on and so on? So for me, you know, if they can keep that question of what if there were no prisons alive in America 50, 60, 100 years, you know, then actually we, in the work that we do in the communities where we live, need to keep those what if questions alive. And yeah, there will be things that don't work and things that do work. And we need to have a culture that celebrates the things that don't work as much as the things that do work, because it's important that we try. And if we expect everything to be successful, we're going to become very disheartened. But yeah, I see enough things moving and changing that it makes me believe that this is possible. And I'm in quite a privileged position where I get to visit many different places where transition is happening, and I meet the mayors there, the local government, who are so excited about these things. This is what we came into politics to do, was to change things and make people's lives better. So I think, you know, often as people who are the kind of the visionary people, we're often 10, 15 years ahead of where everybody else is at. And so the transition movement has spent 15 years trying things, experimenting with things, trying different models, different ways of financing things. And there are loads and loads of stories now of what works. But yeah, we also need to be really, really stubborn, because this doesn't happen overnight. It happens because people just come back day after day and just keep on doing the work that needs to be done.
So you've mentioned that you meet many mayors as well, and one of them said that they used to wish to be a smart city, but now they wish to be a transition city. So what was it all about, and what does it really mean to be a transition city, and what was the context of him saying this?
So that was in Liège in Belgium, which is one of my favorite examples of transition, where the transition group there started something called the Liège Food Belt, Ceinture Alimentaire Liégeoise, which is which started with a what if question, where they said, what if in a generation's time the majority of food eaten in Liège was grown on the land closest to Liège? And it's such a beautiful, beautiful project, which has led to the creation of 27 different cooperatives. They've raised over 5 million euros from the people of the city, investing in those cooperatives. It's just amazing. In the first couple of years, I think the mayor's office thought this was just mad and it was never going to work, and it was all very idealistic. And then they could see it working. They have 4 shops now in the center of the city. It's now the way that the universities and the schools and the hospitals are reimagining how they procure their food. It's a phenomenal, you can see in Liège, a city reimagining its food system. And when I met the mayor of Liège, yeah, he said, we used to say we want to be a smart city, now we want to be a transition city. And I just thought it was the most beautiful thing for him to say, because that's where we need to get to, is where becoming a transition city is more exciting. You know, this idea that the idea of the economy of a city is not to attract as much inward investment as possible, is not to get Apple to come and open a massive Apple store in the middle of the city, is not to get Amazon to build a massive warehouse on the outside, is not that we allow our city economy to become dominated by these kind of extractive industries that just sit there to extract money from our city and take it somewhere else. But that what we want to do is design an economy in the city that enables money to circulate as many times as it possibly can. And that every time that happens, that is to the virtue of the future and the city and its potential. And we see cities now that are starting to do that. I was in Marseille recently in France. I met the mayor, who said, yeah, at the moment, Sodexo have the contract to do all of the school meals, but we've told them they're on notice and they're going to have 4 more years. And then we're going to end their contract. And we are actively buying land around Marseille to create food gardens and to build a whole new infrastructure to supply all of the school meals through food that is grown on land around the edge. And I've been to a city called Charleroi in Belgium, exactly the same thing happening. A town in France called Montsartou, where that already happens. And the municipality bought some land that was going to be used to build luxury homes. And instead they created a farm which now produces 70% of all the food in the schools. And what they found was an amazing cultural shift starting to happen, where families with kids at the schools started to change their shopping habits and how they spent. I mean, they spent more money on organic food. You know, this is the future. You know, Sodexo are the past. And I think, particularly in the French-speaking world, we are seeing more and more and more cities now saying, sorry, we can do better than you, actually. And that feels like where we need to get to me. You know, there's this term in England that is used where if anybody objects to a housing development near where they live, they get called a NIMBY, which stands for not in my backyard. You know, it's the idea, well, the only reason you're opposing it is because it's near where you live and you're being closed-minded, and we're going to call you a NIMBY. And I think we need to replace that with the term of calling people swimbies, which means something wonderful in my backyard. You know, it's not about, well, we're objecting to this because we're just somehow closed-minded and selfish. We're objecting to that because it's crap, and because we could do so much better than that, really. Like, we could design, there could be a housing estate there which is built to incredibly high ecological standards, which is beautiful, which means that the people who live there don't need to pay any money to heat their homes. You know, if you wanted to buy a new computer, for example, you wouldn't go to the shop and just buy any old thing. The guy said, oh, here, have this. You know, you'd be like, no, I've got 600 euros. I want the best machine I can get for 600 euros. You wouldn't settle for anything less, you know. So why would it be that when we're designing the economies of our cities or housing, that we somehow just settle all the time for something that's crap and that doesn't really serve us? You know, we should be designing an economy in our cities that allows the people who live there to absolutely thrive. And one idea is that you change how the school meals happen. Another is you change how the energy system happens. Another is you change how the healthcare system happens. But it does in a way that it's about enabling money and resource to stay and circulate within that city as much as it possibly can, rather than all just pouring out like a bucket full of holes.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that.
A swimby economy, that's what we need.
Maybe that could be a motto.
Maybe.
Well, there's still so many things that I would love to talk to you about, but we're getting kind of long by now. So maybe if you could just share some final thoughts, something that you would like to share with people.
I guess, well, yeah, I think if you've made it this far in listening to this conversation, thank you very much. And thank you for having me on here. I guess I would say that I've been doing quite a lot of reading and writing recently about a guy called Sun Ra, who was an incredible American jazz musician in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, who claimed that he was from Saturn. He claimed that he came from outer space and that all of his music was space music. And he had this big band and they made this incredible music and all the songs were about traveling through space. And he used space as a metaphor for the experience of Black people in America at that time. He said, you know, here on Earth, we have nothing. But actually, what about if actually Black people traveled through space and discovered new planets? And he was an incredible kind of a visionary. And I read a book that described him as being an everyday utopian, in that he had this kind of vision of a utopian future, but he lived it every day. So his whole band wore these incredible kind of space costumes. They looked like sort of a mixture of Egyptian pharaohs and kind of space travelers. And they wore this all the time. If they went to the shops, if they went to do their laundry, they wore this was who they were. They were everyday utopians. He once said his work was once described as being simultaneously local and extraterrestrial, which I really, really loved. And I feel like the thought that I would like to leave people with is, rather than just being the people who tell everybody how terrible everything is, and things are really terrible, and I don't want to downplay the scale and the impact of the climate emergency. As I said earlier, you know, if you're not regularly terrified by it, then you're not paying attention and you're not reading the right things. But at the same time as we have conversations with people about the reality of what's happening, I feel like we need to also be those everyday utopians, you know, those people who are able to bring to life in the imagination of the people we're talking to, the world that we could still create, and to inhabit that as much as we possibly can. So people can see in the way that we talk, in the way that we get around the place. Like, I don't fly, I gave up flying in 2006 and I travel everywhere on the train. And I met a lot of people who said, yeah, I did the same after I saw somebody who actually did that. I didn't know that it was possible. And, you know, so in terms of what we eat and how we cook and how we talk and how we travel and what we do with the piece of land in front of our house and how we talk to colleagues at work, we need to be those everyday utopians who in our imagination have traveled to that kind of future that we talked about earlier in this conversation, but we bring it back into now and we talk about it in such a way that the people around us start to feel that kind of desire and that kind of longing for that future as well. So I guess that would be my last thought, is that we need to all become everyday utopians to help people see what that future could be like.
No, I think that's really wonderful. So really many thanks to being my first interviewee from abroad and for sharing such wonderful like really not just ideas but also experience, showing that really so many wonderful things have been done and can still be done, and that we can really build a wonderful world for all of us, for each one of us. So really many thanks. And of course, many wishes for your future work and all the projects that you're working on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.